Isaac, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Oh, sure. Well, hey, Tom, thanks for having me on and thanks for your watchers. It's great to connect with all of you. I am Isaac Evans-Frantz. I'm a candidate for United States Senate in the Democratic primary in Vermont. I've been endorsed by the Vermont Progressive Party. I'm a lifelong Vermonter, activist, national coalition builder, and I'm so excited to be here with you.
Cool. Appreciate it as always. Could you tell me a little bit more about your platform and what it is that inspired you to run for office?
I'm an organizer and activist. I've spent the last several years building national coalitions to stop US participation in the unconstitutional war in Yemen and building a national coalition for a global economic response to the pandemic. We've been successful with both of these initiatives, but we haven't gotten there quite yet. There's more work to be done. And when I saw how much everyday Americans, when we come together, can accomplish, I knew that I had to step forward and continue to build my leadership and to bring more voices of more everyday Americans to the table, to Washington, D.C., so that we can have a country that truly reflects the diversity of voices, of perspectives, and the power of people who organize.
Cool. And what other platforms? You said you've had success at these things. What kind of success have you had at doing these?
Sure. With the Global COVID Response Coalition, globalcovidresponse.org, we built a national coalition with organizations across the country representing tens of millions of Americans that succeeded at passing legislation through the United States House of Representatives, not once, not twice, but 3 times, for authorization at the International Monetary Fund for the release of hundreds of billions of international funds, international resources called special drawing rights. And I know that's really a technical term. I'd never heard of special drawing rights before the pandemic, but basically it's like an international currency that 190 countries got as a result of the work that our organizations, over 100 organizations that I brought together, what we did. We got the legislation passed through the House. We got senators from key committees to write to the administration. We spoke with members of the Treasury Department, and we secured this support at the International Monetary Fund. And the United States support was critical in making this difference. It meant that about 100 countries were able to pay off debt, international debt. They were able to fund their budgets during this economic crisis, and they were able to deliver for their people. So this is something that I'm proud of, and it's something that was the direct result of everyday Americans, farmers in the Midwest, nuns in the Northeast, activists in Washington, people that I was able to bring together to build this coalition of voices for prosperity for all. The other success that I'd like to share with you is our work in stopping the illegal US participation in the war in Yemen. Just last week, Senator Sanders, Senator Leahy, both from Vermont, along with Senator Warren, introduced a resolution in the United States Senate to stop unconstitutional US participation in the war in Yemen, which has caused one of the largest humanitarian crises. Actually, the United Nations has said it's the largest humanitarian crisis on the face of the planet. It's been created by Saudi Arabia and its allies like the United States. And this is something that we have been successful with in the past. When President Trump was in power, we were able to pass legislation, this war powers resolution, through the United States House of Representatives and through the United States Senate. The House is controlled by Democrats. The Senate was controlled by Republicans. We were able to get that bipartisan legislation through to President Trump's desk. He vetoed it. And now we're doing the same thing with President Biden, just as he's gotten back from doing his famous fist pump with Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, the dictator of Saudi Arabia. So I am so proud of what we've been able to accomplish so far. The fact that we were able to get legislation to the president's desk after we had been told, activists like me had been told by policy experts in DC, really well-respected liberal voices that we were not going to be able to accomplish this, that we might make things worse, that we shouldn't mess up what they were trying to do in Washington. We showed the world that everyday Americans can make a difference when we show up in front of our congressional offices, when we show up and we refuse to back down. But we say, no, the United States is complicit in the largest humanitarian crisis on the planet. We have no business being in there. The Congress never authorized this war. We are going to stand up and demand that Congress reclaim its power over war and peace. And that's exactly what we did. It's exactly what we've done in Vermont, and it's exactly what we've done around this country.
So what are the next steps? Are you done in those areas, or what can be done now?
There's so much more that's needed. So in the case of the war in Yemen, the home of the largest humanitarian crisis on the planet, we're seeing the Saudi crown prince, who's a dictator, who was responsible for the murder of the Washington Post journalist. He has been responsible for the killing of so many people in Yemen, civilians. And he's doing to Yemen what Putin has been doing to Ukraine. And that's what he is. The Saudi dictator, MBS, he started doing that over 7 years ago with complicity and support and backing from the United States. And it's happened under 2 Democratic administrations and 1 Republican administration. So what needs to happen now is for Nancy Pelosi to have a vote on the bipartisan Yemen War Powers resolution that over 100 members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, have put out on the floor of they've introduced it into the United States House of Representatives. And now we've had it introduced by an independent senator and 2 Democratic senators in the Senate. We need Republican senators to join that effort. We need everyday Americans, people who are watching this video who care about the United States Constitution and believe in the Congress has the power over war, not the president. People who believe in standing up and having integrity in our foreign policy. This is the time for you as viewers to contact your senators, your representatives, and tell them that you want them to co-sponsor the Yemen War Powers resolution. And folks can do that by calling 1-833-STOP-WAR. And when you call 1-833-STOP-WAR, you'll be connected with your congressional office and you can share your opinion.
So what is America doing in Yemen? How are we complicit? What are we doing in order to support that war?
The United States has been providing logistical support, military support, spare parts, and it's been providing weapons that have been used on Yemeni civilians. The United States has been enabling this crisis because Congress has not declared that the president may no longer use U.S. intelligence to assist Saudi Arabia in dropping bombs on Yemen. The president of the United States, Joe Biden, pledged during his campaign that he would stop participation in the Saudi war in Yemen. He said that we need to stand by our values, we need to stand for human rights, that those are non-negotiable, and that we should not compromise in order to get cheaper oil or to sell more weapons. And so this is a matter of Congress standing up to the president. It doesn't matter the party of the president. It's Congress's job to stand up for its power and to stand up for what is right.
Why is it that you think the president and America has supported Saudi Arabia for so long, even though we know they have done so many illegal, harmful things?
The geopolitical reasons. It's about oil. It's about military in the military industrial complex. It's about these relationships that are prioritized with other countries over what's good for Americans and over what's good for people around the world. If you look at the history of the United States, there's been a history of invading other countries, of supporting dictators, of supporting invasions that the United States has no business in first dropping bombs and then talking afterwards. There is a history of militarism and domination around the world. And when I've spoken to high-level staff members and US senators themselves, this is what I understand, is that the bipartisan consensus in this country is that the number one role for the United States in the world is to exert influence and power over other countries. I happen to have a different vision for United States foreign policy, one that's about global citizenship, one that's about moral responsibility and integrity, and about being good global partners. and addressing the shared crises that we face, like the climate crisis, like nuclear weapons, like the economic crisis, like the public health crises. These are things where we need global cooperation. And this is a time for us to be standing up to dictators wherever they may be, and people who commit aggressions on their neighbors, whether it's Russia or whether it's Saudi Arabia.
And if the bill passes, what is it going to accomplish? What is it going to change?
This has already accomplished something just by the fact that it's been introduced. And let me be clear that this would not have happened without the organizing of people across the country. And I'm particularly proud of the folks who here in Vermont rallied on March 1st in the cold in front of Congressman Welch's office and in front of Senator Sanders' offices, and have called and written and rallied and organized and gotten multiple organizations across this state. And we've done this in many other countries. The national coalition that I built, every75seconds.org, 75, the number 75, every75seconds.org. You can learn more about this humanitarian crisis in Yemen, but it was the organizing that we've done that got this legislation introduced. And just by it being introduced, that sends a clear message to President Biden that he must address the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Bernie was just on ABC this weekend. He was talking about how Biden should never have gone to Saudi Arabia to do the famous fist pump with the Saudi dictator. That was inappropriate in light of what Saudi Arabia has done, the crimes that that country has committed against Americans, like the Washington Post journalist, against Saudi dissidents, against women in Saudi Arabia, and I would add, against their neighbors in Yemen.
What does the bill actually do? What is written into the bill, and how is it going to change things?
Sure. The bill stops intelligence sharing with the Saudi intervention in Yemen. It says that intelligence from the United States cannot be used for Saudi intervention in Yemen. It cannot be used for airstrikes. It stops the coordination of military support, logistical support, that means spare parts, maintenance for the Saudi fighter jets, because it's US contracting companies, which, we haven't gotten all the answers from the administration on this, but we understand that it would be US service members who are coordinating that whole process of servicing the Saudi fighter jets. And mind you that Saudi Arabia has so much power in this country. We are up against incredibly difficult odds because Saudi Arabia has like almost as many, I haven't counted lately, but I know that the number of lobbyists that they have working in the United States is more or less about as many members of Congress that we have. That's what I've heard before, and I believe it, because when I've spoken with members of Congress, they've said, we hear a lot from the Saudi lobby in this country. All those PR firms, all the folks in DC who are doing the bidding of the dictatorship. So we need people to stand up and people to call that number, that 1-833 Stop War number. And we need to elect leaders like myself who are not entrenched, who are not part of the establishment, who are not beholden to the Saudi interests, the weapons manufacturer interests, who have donated tens of thousands of dollars to my competitor in this race, who are not taking that kind of corporate PAC money, people who are willing to stand up to leadership, willing to stand up to members of our own party for what is right.
A person in my audience asked a really relevant question. If the U.S. leaves the relationship with Saudi Arabia, will the Russians and Chinese be able to pick up that relationship and benefit by utilizing their cheaper oil prices and things? And so is it a concern that if we stop enabling these kinds of crimes, there's a consequence in that the economic benefit can go to our competitors?
It's a valid, understandable concern, but that's very unlikely to happen quite like that, because this is the way it works, is that those fighter jets that Saudi Arabia uses were made in the United States. So you can't just go to China or Russia and buy spare parts that will work with our fighter jets. Saudi Arabia is dependent on the United States for its might and its military force that it's using in Yemen. It would take years in order for them to totally replace their air force. Bruce Rydell from Brookings Institute, who used to work for the CIA and is an expert, knows way more than I do about the inner workings of the US military and government. he's been really clear that the United States could ground the Saudi Air Force overnight. And it's not like tomorrow they'd be able to suddenly wake up and find that Russia and China had completely developed a whole nother air fleet for them that they're ready to purchase. I mean, that would be extremely expensive for Saudi Arabia. So no, it would not be easy for Saudi Arabia to switch overnight to other countries for sourcing its logistical and military support to continue enabling its war in Yemen.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I would totally agree with you there. But the question is more, if we stop supporting them and we did ground their military might, it seems like they would begin that process of seeking different avenues of supporting their military. And that would also probably lead to things like subsidies on oil for other countries, or cheaper oil for other countries, or more military bases for other countries, all the things that America takes advantage of in the relationship with Saudi Arabia would seem to begin to happen for China and Russia, wouldn't they?
Listen, that stuff is already happening. I mean, Saudi Arabia, when the United States has put up all these sanctions against Russia, where do you think Saudi Arabia is supplementing their oil? They're turning to Russia. So they're already doing that. So this idea that the United States can somehow control other countries and is just going to play favorites, and we're going to be friends with some dictators and enable them and support them in committing crimes against humanity while we protest and send, and impose sanctions on other countries. It makes absolutely no sense. It's morally wrong. And it's not good for the United States to earn a reputation of just going for the cheapest oil and that being the number one priority for the United States. And that's what it looks like. I mean, President Biden has broken his word in making that trip to Saudi Arabia. And we've called on him to use his relationship. If he's going to have that relationship, then use it to stop the war in Yemen. He could do that. And Congress can do that. But it's a matter of political will.
Yeah, you mentioned the cheaper oil thing. Do you know how much oil prices would increase if we did have a more difficult relationship with Saudi Arabia? How would this impact the everyday voter and their lifestyle?
Hey, listen, the prices at the pump have already been real high. I think it's been real clear that no matter what the United States does, that the Saudi Arabia has been holding pretty firm in making sure that our prices are high. But it's not just Saudi Arabia that controls the oil prices in the world. The United States has the war in Ukraine and the pandemic have a lot to do with it. So, and this is also points to the need for the United States to develop energy independence. And I believe strongly that that needs to be sustainable, renewable, clean, safe energy. That's an important long-term strategy to pursue, not just for the future of our children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and this planet, but also for our national security.
But I presume you'd want to. Oh, what is this? Froze.
I love all these questions coming in. This is awesome.
Oh, one sec. My end froze for some reason. All right, there we go. I think we're back. Presumably, you want to stop the war in Yemen immediately today, if you could, correct?
That would be great.
And that would most likely involve putting a strain on our relationship with Saudi Arabia, and they would probably increase gas prices more. Presumably, they would not be happy about this. I imagine.
Listen, Saudi Arabia has already been punishing the United States. They've already been punishing the United States. I think that to say, oh, if we do the right thing, that's going to suddenly, this fear that that's going to cause gas prices to go up even higher, I just think is a miscalculation. But at the end of the day, I would be willing to pay another $1 at the pump so that I knew that millions of children were not going to starve to death as a result of my country's foreign policy. That's something I'm willing to do. And I understand that that's easier for me to say than for other people to say. And I would be willing to pay an extra $1 at the pump so the people next door who depend on an automobile to get to work, so that they don't have to pay that. I am willing to do that because that's the morally right thing to do, is that we may not, if we continue to sell our soul as a nation because we're going to go for the cheapest oil, because we're more worried about a few extra cents. And I don't think it's a matter of dollars that we're going to have to be paying. But if that's really what it's about, then I will pay that price. I will pay that price because you know what? There are people who have fought and lost their lives fighting for our country, who've been fighting for an ideal, one of democracy, of peace, of justice for all. And if we're saying that actually what matters most to us is how cheap oil is, how the price of gas at the pump, which I differ with that calculation, as I said, but if it came to that, at what point do we draw the line? At what point do we say, actually, a human life, the lives of millions of children in the world, that's actually priceless. To me, a human life has a value that is beyond the price of gas.
Okay, and what is your takeaway from Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia? What do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm getting a little heated over here. Gotta take off this jacket.
Turn this into a whole different kind of stream real quick.
Ask the question again. I'm happy to talk about other subjects as well.
Yeah. So what is your takeaway from Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia? What do you think about the trip, its consequences, its benefits?
About the fist
Well,
scene
about his
around the
trip in
world.
general.
The fist pump scene around the world, as my colleague calls it.
Well, more about the political implications of what went on during the trip. The fist bump is more just a political kind of a thing, like a picture or something. But I'm like more interested in what are the implications of the policies and actions he took, and how that's seen by the world, and what it's going to lead to in the future.
Mm-hmm. My concern about, and I would say that the image of the fist pump seen around the world does have real implication politically. Like you said, it's political stunt, but it also has political implications which affect policy. You know, the role of the president is not just about signing bills into law. It's also about leadership. And that's the same argument that I have in this race for US Senate, that we need leaders who are honest, who have integrity, who keep their promises. So my concern is that this shows that this is, in a way, that sort of blank check for war that the United States so often has given. And this is really the time for the United States Senate to use its power, for the United States House of Representatives to stand up and to say it's time for the United States to stop US participation, illegal participation in the war in Yemen that Congress never authorized.
Question for the audience. Did Biden tell the Saudis to take in Middle Eastern and African refugees?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said that was a question for the audience.
Oh, from the audience to you. Like, did Biden tell the Saudis to take in Middle Eastern and African refugees?
I'm not aware of that.
All right, fair enough. There was one thing I keep getting asked repeatedly about my interviews is the Democrats have been criticized as having known the Roe v. Wade ruling was coming, but had done nothing. What do you think that the Democrats could have done or could do now to try to protect women's reproductive rights, knowing that Roe v. Wade has been overturned?
Thanks for asking this. And this is a question that I've heard as well. You know, the past is over. I'd like to focus on what we can do at this point. The second part of your question, which is what can we do now? And what we can do now is what we haven't done in the past, which is to codify rights. Right now, we need to protect people patients who are seeking abortion. We need to protect doctors and other medical providers and make sure that they are able to provide the services, that receive the services, and that we can have the delivery of care that people need for their well-being. That's a key priority. So making sure that there's decriminalization, making sure that people can travel from one state to another, that we're going to protect the rights of people to travel. Last I checked, that was a fundamental right in this country, was you can travel from one state to another. So I'd like to see that right upheld. That's something that Congress can do. Congress needs to codify these laws. And yes, Congress has failed. That's why we need something different from the status quo. That's why we need to bring the voices of the majority of Americans to Washington. That's why we need to elect leaders who are willing to challenge the status quo, who are willing to stand up, who are willing to bring a real fight to the discussion, to bring energy and passion, who will compromise, but not on their values.
Well, I'm really interested in the first part too, because people have always said a lot of the big social media commenters are saying that Democrats should have done something once they knew that preemptively that Roe v. Wade was going to be overturned, but never say what. Do you have any ideas what Democrats could have done in that situation that they didn't do? What could they have done differently?
We could have gotten rid of the filibuster. We could have passed legislation codifying the right to an abortion. The Supreme Court, there are three branches of government, right? And Congress is one of those. So if one of them is failing, and we know one of them is failing, it's not representing the majority of Americans, it's out of touch with this country, and that's the Supreme Court, then we need Congress to act. We need Congress to pick up the slack. And this is still a moment when Congress can act. It's the last minute is still a minute.
So what do you think about the ideas of setting up abortion clinics on federal land, or the telehealth service where you can get abortion pills through mail via the federal government, and funding abortion travel for people, so they can giving them vouchers or things so they can travel and take time off work to be able to get abortions in other states? Do you think those are viable options?
Yes, I would support all of those. And I will support all those initiatives as a US Senator. I have seen, as a reproductive health educator, I worked for years in a community health center, and I was the person who provided the vast majority of the pregnancy test results to patients when they came in, and the pregnancy options counseling, comprehensive options counseling. That included talking about parenting, talking about adoption, and talking about abortion as viable options, providing rural information and referrals to people. I remember a conservative Catholic woman who had come in for a pregnancy test result, and she had been trying to avoid pregnancy. She had a positive result. She explained to me that in her family it was unacceptable to have an abortion, but because of medical complications, she had to have one. She felt shame, and I could feel that coming from her in that moment. I was so glad that I could be there with her and provide those options with her, provide something to her. I couldn't take away all of her feelings, but I could give her options and a choice. That's the sort of choice that we need to continue to be able to give the people in this country, so that parenting is a choice.
Cool, for sure. Um, I've been recently researching into Citizens United, case. What is your take on Citizens United and the ruling and the case itself? Because there seems to be a difference in the case from the ruling, because the case, I believe, was just about a production media company doing advertising for their documentary or whatever, and the Supreme Court ruled that it's okay for them to advertise for their documentary, which has then led to this statement that you can do infinite amounts of funding for political parties, essentially. What is your take on the dichotomy between the actual court case and the take that it's had on funding for political candidates?
This is an area where I need to learn more, but I will say this. Citizens United must be overturned. And I am committed to making sure that we get big money from big corporations out of our political system, so it's not dominating the agenda in this country. Because in order for us to have the healthcare that we need, to have the housing, to have the education, to be able to meet the needs of our people in this country, we must get those corporate dollars out of our political system. So one of the ways that I am acting on this is, from the start of my political career, I am not taking a single dollar from corporate PACs. That's something that Bernie has committed to doing, and he's done for his decades in public office, and that's something that I'm committed to doing. Unfortunately, there's a lot of cynicism out there, and a lot of folks will say, hey, this is the game, we got to play it. But that's not leadership. The leadership we need is people who are willing to say, nope, I'm not going to accept it. And we are going to implement alternatives. We're going to have public financing of elections. We're going to implement legislation for transparency and accountability for lobbyists, so that the folks who are funding the campaigns and the folks who are making policy are separate. So fundraising and policy making are two different things. This is what I know, this is what I believe, and this is what I will continue to work for and to stand for.
Yeah. So I totally can recognize the sentiment to overturn Citizens United. That was initially what I felt too, based off of what people were telling me. But when I actually researched into it, it seems like all it says is that people who create documentaries or whatever can pay for advertisement for their documentaries. And so it doesn't seem like there's any funding of political candidates directly coming from any organization there, saying is they can buy advertisements to represent their freedom of speech or something along those lines. So, I mean, would you be, in the direct court case, would you be against a production company buying advertisements for their documentary during an election time?
What I believe in is that we need the voice of we have freedom of speech for people, not for corporations. And so what you just described was a company trying to buy, if I understood you right, a company buying advertisements, right, for political advertisements, right? And with Citizens United, there's no limit, right? The sky is the limit. You can pay as much money as you want to support a candidate as a company, as a PAC, as a super PAC. You can it's just unlimited. And that's not acceptable, because that actually overpowers the people that we're trying to protect, which is people. Because this country was designed for people. That's the idea of our Constitution, is that it's supposed to represent the interests of the American people, not of the wealthy corporate interests that are dominating our political agenda.
So what would the solution be? Do you think they should just ban any kind of buying advertisements for a documentary if you make it during an election period?
The solution is to have limits, to have reasonable limits, caps on how much money can be spent, how much money can be donated. As someone who's committed to not taking a single nickel of corporate PAC money, I raised $100,000 in the first quarter of my campaign. Just filed with Federal Elections Commission. You can track where every dollar of that came from, and it's all from individuals. It's all from human beings, from Americans, from people, right? Unfortunately, there are folks like my opponent who have been taking millions of dollars over many, many years from corporate PACs. And so that buys influence, that buys access, and that's not acceptable. And separately, there we have companies and big corporations that are funneling huge amounts of money to run advertisements, to run campaigns without necessarily coordinating with a campaign, but that are hugely boosting some candidates who are hugely attacking other candidates. And it's unfair. It makes it really hard to have the sort of diversity of perspective that we need to have a healthy democracy. Listen, there's never been an openly gay male US senator. Can you imagine that? In this country where some X% of the people are gay, we've never had that. If the people of Vermont elect me on August 9th in the Democratic primary, I am basically set to be a shoo-in for the first openly gay male US senator. And that matters because diversity matters. Having different perspectives matters. But if we just allow the corporate PACs to dominate our agenda, it's going to be really hard to have the sort of diversity that this country needs in its government.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I'm an atheist, and so I think we've only had one or two openly gay, or openly atheist senators in like the history of America. So I totally agree that the homogeny of what we have in office is definitely not a good thing by any means. We've been talking a little bit about money in politics. How would you get money out of politics, especially in the campaign trail? Because as I understand it, senators usually have to spend up to like 50% of their time fundraising for their party. How exactly can we change that to make it more where they're actually doing their job instead of raising money and talking to rich people all the time?
We start by talking to people across the class spectrum. I biked across the state for my campaign, from the banks of the Connecticut River to the shores of Lake Champlain, and talking to everyday Vermonters. So sure, I've been fundraising, I've been calling donors around Vermont and beyond, but this is the thing, is that I am committed to bringing the voices of everyday people to Washington. And we do that by refusing to take the corporate PAC money. We do that by following the example of many other politicians who've had that sort of integrity and said, this is the system. I'm going to challenge that system and I'm going to lead by example.
Are you for implementing something more like the UK system, which has a much more strict policy on fundraising and how much money they can get?
Absolutely. I absolutely agreed. Would readily agree to spending limits in this campaign. I have challenged my competitor to return the money that he has taken from corporate PACs. I very much support the idea of having limits on campaign fundraising, campaign spending. I don't think Vermonters benefit from millions and millions and millions of dollars being spent on these political campaigns. It's just that's not the Vermont that I grew up in. That's not the Vermont I know, and that's not the Vermont I want for the future. I do believe in public financing of elections. It helps even the playing field. So you have some criteria, like in Vermont, there's a criteria that and it's just for some of the races, we could expand that. So for the governor's race, the lieutenant governor's race, you raise a certain number of small donations from Vermonters, you then qualify for public financing. I believe in that. There's some threshold to show that you actually are viable, that you have that support, but it's not then dependent on the wealthiest Americans. We've seen the class divide in this country just expand dramatically just in my lifetime. I'm 40 years old. And when in these 40 years, it's just become more and more intense where the wealthiest Americans own an increasingly large percentage of the wealth and the power in our country.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of funding from certain state elections actually comes from people who aren't in the state. A large percentage, even the majority of funding can come from people out of state. And I think that's a very strange thing, don't you? Like the people who have the most influence over an election of a state should be the people who live there.
Yes, I agree
Uh,
with you.
as you mentioned, you're an openly gay man. How do you think that changes your perspective, and what other kinds of perspectives does that bring in that aren't normally in office?
Yeah. Well, I'm also from a low-income family. When I was growing up, we lived at the first few months of my life, we lived in sheds. And we lived in a shed that at one point that was uninsulated. And if you've ever been to Vermont in the winter, maybe I don't know where you live, but some folks come here
Minnesota,
skiing in
so
the winter, and it gets cold here.
yeah.
So it got cold with no insulation. And you know what? Our neighbors invited us in. They had us come live with them when it got cold in December. And that's the sort of spirit that I bring to office, one of compassion, one of neighborliness. And so to me, it doesn't matter where you live, you're my neighbor. That's the spirit that I bring, a one where we welcome one another into our homes, where we welcome people to the tables of power, and we bring the voices of everyday people to Washington. In terms of being an openly gay man, I've experienced violence, I've been experienced being left out. And so I do have that experience. I think all of us have been left out or left behind in some way or other. So I'm there to stand up for people who've been left behind. I'm there to stand up for the dairy farmer who's losing her farm, her livelihood. I'm there to stand up for the nurse like the nurse that I met in Burlington, who's homeless because she got sick with COVID, was in the hospital, and then couldn't afford her rent. So she's now living on the street with her dog. You know, I'm there to stand up for the people, the working people of this country, the people who have been marginalized, people who've lost family members to police violence, to racism. I'm there to stand up for every American, no matter where you live.
A question I have is, are you afraid of being discriminated against? Because I know that a lot of the Republicans, especially in the Senate, are very religious. And are you afraid of being discriminated against from the very religious side of the political parties?
I'm not, I appreciate your honesty and your openness about being an atheist. I happen to be a person of faith. I belong to a church. I lead a weekly morning prayer service. And, for me, my faith is a source of inspiration and a source of connection. When I was convening this global COVID response coalition, globalcovidresponse.org, brought together conservative Republicans, conservative Christians, nuns, people across this country. And what I really loved was getting to build those relationships with people who have probably different views than I do on things like marriage equality or job discrimination. But we were able to find common ground, and we were able to get legislation passed and policy changed and work towards saving millions of people's lives around the world. So to me, this is, I'm used to discrimination. I've been discriminated against my whole life. I've lost jobs that I was good at. I was a teacher for years. I was teaching middle school, and they were uncomfortable with having an openly gay male teacher, and they were upfront with me about that. And I was unwilling to be silent about who I love. That's just part of who I am, and I'm going to bring that same sort of energy, that same unwillingness to be silent in the face of injustice to the role of U.S. Senate. So to me, it's an asset to have diversity. I think about pandemics. I think about what my community was going through when I was coming out as a teenager in the 90s in terms of the HIV and AIDS epidemic. That I think about what would have been like if there was an openly gay male U.S. senator who could have shared from his perspective about what was happening to his community. What would that have meant in terms of saving lives, not just for our community of LGBTQ plus people, but also for all Americans, people who have lost their lives and their loved ones to AIDS.
So what are the big problems that your constituency is facing, and what do you think are the solutions to try to mitigate those problems?
Housing and healthcare are major challenges for Vermonters. I know they're major challenges for our fellow Americans across this country. There's not enough housing. I was just talking to a man up in a rural part of Vermont the other day. He said, this past weekend, he said he waited 6 years to get on a waiting list for Section 8 vouchers, the housing vouchers. 6 years. How do you tell someone, oh, well, just wait a few more years and then we'll get you housing? How do you tell somebody that? How do we do that as a country? This is supposed to be the greatest country on earth. This is one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest country. This country has so many resources, but right now we have middle-class families that are paying higher tax rates than billionaires in our country. Higher tax rates than middle-class Vermont families, teachers, police officers, folks who are part of our middle class who are paying a higher tax rate than billionaires. So first of all, we need to make sure that we have a fair tax system that's not controlled by corporate interests, that's not controlled by those corporate dollars, which fund my competitor. We need to make sure that we have a fair tax system. That's the first thing. We need to make sure everybody has healthcare, guarantee healthcare and housing for everyone. From my experience working in community health centers, I saw times when our health center, which is supposed to provide care for everyone, no matter how much money they have, turned people away for care. And that was because they couldn't afford the low end of the sliding scale for dental care. How is it that we treat our mouths and our minds as though they're not part of our body? Last I checked, my teeth are in my body. My head is part of the body. So we should be providing mental health care, dental health care as part of our comprehensive health that we provide to Americans. And I believe in a system, not just Medicare for all, but improved Medicare for all. Because my parents use Medicare, but dental care is not included in that. Why is that? Because as I said, the mouth is part of the body. If you get an infection in your mouth, you don't get the treatment that you need. That infection can spread and ends up costing all of us a lot more. So let's have a sane, rational system that saves our system money and that gets more bang for our buck.
Is there a healthcare system from other countries around the world that you think we should emulate, that you think their system is doing it really well and theirs is better than ours in certain ways that we can copy from?
Yeah, I mean, there are elements of Canada's system, elements of the UK system. And, I've worked in federally qualified health centers, and they're doing pretty good. I was the quality coordinator for a number of years as well. And we saw that the best healthcare in this country, some of the best care is provided in those community health centers because they're so regulated that you have to do well or you're going to get shut down. You're going to lose your federal funding. So we've actually, the federal government has, in expanding care for people as part of the Affordable Care Act, has implemented quality standards that are modeled after the federally qualified health centers. So we actually are doing some things right, and we need to build on that. The federally qualified health centers are are a system that does work for a lot of low income folks in this country. It's something that we should expand that model. I'm proud of Bernie Sanders for his work helping get the funding for those health centers. And we need now a system that doesn't mean, right now we have doctors having worked with medical care providers, they're spending like half of their time doing billing. You have, for every medical care provider, you have multiple billers. I mean, how does that make any sense? They're spending their time doing paperwork, entering all of these forms so that people can get their insurance to pay for their care. It's a system that it's not prioritizing people, it's prioritizing the status quo, it's the establishment and the moneyed interests in our country. So that must change. You asked about priorities, a couple other things that really matter to Vermonters. One is childcare. Turns out that when people can get free or low cost quality childcare, they're more likely to be able to participate in our workforce. They're more able to provide better care for their children when they're with their children, to have a little bit more to be able to offer to their families and to our communities. Climate change. This is something that's real concern for a lot of Vermonters. We love our state. We love the beauty of this natural world, and our state is gorgeous, and we love it. And we love our snow. We love the way of life that we have here, and it's getting our weather is getting wetter. We're seeing our state bird is expected to be gone from our hills within 25 years, according to a recent report from the University of Vermont. We must take action on this, and this is something that Vermonters are committed to. They're committed to doing our part as a state, but we understand that we need federal action on this, and that's partly why I'm running to be the next junior U.S. Senator from Vermont.
I had a question from the audience about healthcare from Tim West. What can Congress do to support children with autism so that those children can become more productive members of society?
We need to invest in education for people with disabilities. When I was a high school student serving as the first student voting member of the Vermont State Board of Education, this is something that I championed, was funding for people with disabilities, making sure that folks who with autism are getting the care and attention that they need.
Yeah, it's definitely a relevant issue for me because I'm autistic. So appreciate Tim bringing that up. You mentioned taxes and having a tax policy that isn't governed by lobbyists. But what specific tax policies do you think we could change to make it more fair? Because I think right now you mentioned that the taxes that the rich are paying is far lower than the taxes that the everyday American is paying. A lot of that has to do with the fact that they're making most of their money off stocks and stock buybacks. Do you have any specific policy changes you would implement in order to make the tax system more fair?
Yeah, well, on the wealthy end, I would increase the capital gains tax. On the low income side, I would expand the earned income tax. I would expand the child tax credit to last year's levels. That lifted millions of children out of poverty. And what was great is that they were payments over 6 months. So one of the challenges is if you give folks just a big lump sum of money all at once, it can get spent real fast and then there's nothing left and then people are back in poverty. But if you can provide support and relief over a time like we did last year in those last 6 months of 2021, that can be really helpful. And that was helpful to middle class families, that was helpful to low income families. I'm so happy that we were able to do that as a country, and there's no reason we can't do that again. And I know there is bipartisan potential for that. That's something that we could do. That's something that I will work hard for, is to make sure that working Americans get the sort of support that they need. And we should be lessening the taxes on working Americans and increasing the taxes on the wealthiest Americans.
Yeah, the EITC, I think, was statistically the most successful policy to raise people out of poverty that America has ever implemented. And I'm wondering why, given how successful it was at raising people out of poverty, why haven't we done more things like that?
I asked myself the same question. I think that one of the reasons why we haven't done more is because we forget our power. We forget our power as everyday Americans. This is one of the biggest joys I've had, is being able to organize everyday people and being part of social movements. I organized with some colleagues and the largest anti-war coordination since 2003, when we organized the World Says No to War on Yemen Global Day of Action. Tens of thousands of people during the pandemic were marching in the street, were participating in online rallies from 400 organizations from 30 countries signed on to the statement that I sent out from my Yahoo account. That's the kind of support that we got. And when I see that sort of willingness of people around the world, around this country, to stand up for what they believe in, I know that we can restore faith and confidence in our democracy, because this democracy belongs to us. We are the ones that we've been waiting for.
Yeah, you say that, but I'm a little skeptical because I know that there's a large percent of Americans who agree on a number of policies. I think there's like 70% approval for legalization of marijuana, something like 80% for women's reproductive rights. Most Americans agree on a large number of issues, but we never see those issues being taken seriously by the Senate. Why do you think there is? Why do you think there's this big divide between what Americans really want, but never see that happening in the law?
I think there are two reasons. The first is that we have a system that's, our Senate is not representative of the population, so it's not a proportional representative body. It favors states like mine that are rural and that are lowly populated at the expense of states that have large populations, which tend to have folks who are going to have more of that public interest sort of policy in terms of the environment, in terms of priorities for folks in a lot of cities. So I don't think that setup makes sense anymore. It made sense when our country was founded, when you had a more evenly distributed population, but doesn't make sense anymore. So population wise, our Senate is not representative of the country. But second of all, this is where I see that politicians for too long have benefited from divisiveness within our society. Political and economic elites in our country separate us along issues of race, gender, sexuality, immigration. They keep us separate, and that makes it harder for us to organize to get the sorts of public interest policies that we need, like universal public health care, like access to abortion, like a sane economic policy where working middle income folks are not paying such a high tax rate compared to the billionaires in this country. So what we need is leaders who are willing to stand up for workers' rights, for the right to organize, who can restore economic prosperity in this country, because with economic prosperity we get political power from that. When unions are strong, we will have more strength. And that's something that I've seen in my lifetime, starting with Reagan and ever since, is this erosion of our unions, the erosion of their power. We haven't seen the raises in working people's wages compared to where our economy is for decades. We talk about $15 an hour, $15 as a livable wage. If we were to keep up with the rate of growth in our country, it would be $20, $25. It would be a lot more money than what we're seeing. So we need to be organizing. We need to be reclaiming power as Americans. We need to be standing up for what the majority wants. And the majority wants prosperity for all. The majority wants healthcare for all. The majority wants housing for all. The majority wants to leave a planet that's in better shape than where we have found it.
Yeah, one of the people in the audience has brought up a good question. The Republican question is always, how are you going to pay for it? It seems like the biggest concern the Republican side has, or at least pretends to have, is that we don't have enough money to fund all of this. What's going to happen if we spend all this money? It seems like it could cause like an economic collapse. All these big worries about spending money. What would your response be to the Republican statement that's, how are you going to pay for this?
Well, first of all, I have to confess that personally, I'm very frugal. I have holes in my sneakers. I still am wearing those to the parades. I have to, we have to, you have to realize that you can be frugal, but you can be smart and invest in your fellow human beings. We can be generous. This sort of mentality of scarcity is what drives so many of our problems. It's so interesting. When I was working on this global pandemic relief, I saw this mentality of scarcity at play. where I was talking to Republican senators. I talked about a third of the US Senate offices with constituents, bring them together. And, there were folks who couldn't quite believe, how could you actually be releasing international resources? They're not US tax dollars, but they're international funds from the International Monetary Fund. How could those be released? How could these special drawing rights be released and that not cost American taxpayers? And the thing is that they just don't cost US taxpayers, but it was something that was really hard for people to wrap their minds around. So I go back to my faith, and my faith says to love my neighbor. My faith says that my job is to show up and be the best person I can and to love one another. And that's what's at the heart of it. And that's something that resonates with people across the political spectrum. Because when I was bringing the Republican corn growers to meet with their Republican senators, and they were speaking to them, and their senator was asking them, well, how are you going to support this policy about giving more resources to people who are hungry? They said, listen, Senator, I'm a lifelong Republican, but I'm a farmer. And when I see people going hungry, I know we can do something about it, and I know that we have to do something about it. I believe in making sure that everybody's needs are met, and I know that we can do that when we bring people together across political division, across communities, that we can achieve the sort of change that we need.
A really relevant concern concerning global warming and food shortages. What is your concern about the upcoming food shortage, especially given how much the climate has changed and how much farmland has been impacted, arable land has decreased? What is your solution to try to mitigate the upcoming food crisis that we're going to face?
We already are facing food crises around the world, whether it's in East Africa, whether it's in Yemen, and even in parts of this country where people can't access the healthy food that they need. So the way that the problem that I see is one of a concentration of wealth into the power of too few hands, the concentration of power into too few hands. And that's why I'm running for US Senate. I'm running to redistribute power so that everyday people who care about people who care about our climate, who care about our country, so that we get the power, so that everyday working Americans have a say in our government, because that's the sort of country that we need. That's the sort of world that I believe in. So we're not going to solve the climate crisis unless we solve the democracy crisis, unless we solve the wealth crisis. Because we know that the interests of the largest corporations, of the fossil fuel industry, are not in line with the interests of Americans. But the interests of Americans will be defended when we win Senate seats, when we win our country back, when we have everyday people who have been told that they don't belong, who've been told that their place is not in Washington, who've been told that they're too young, that they're too gay, that they're too poor. When we have those people representing in Washington, those people like me, we will have the country that we need, the country that we deserve.
Cool. We've been going for about an hour. It was a great conversation. I really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your campaign, support your campaign, and follow you?
Yes, you can find me at isaacforvermont.com. That's all spelled out. Isaac, FORVERMONT. So isaacforvermont.com. And you can also follow me on social media. That's Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at the @ symbol. And then Isaac for spelled out VT. Isaac for VT for spelled out. I would love to
Awesome.
connect with you. I look forward to hearing from you. Please engage with me on social media, and I look forward to earning your support for this campaign.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you to everybody watching.
See you later.